Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you to a truly significant moment as we ramp up to the 20th anniversary of Design Miami in 2025. This milestone presents an opportunity to reflect on all that this 2-decade period has encompassed for our brand. To mark the occasion, we're bringing together leading voices that have shaped the fair from its earliest beginnings to this phenomenal edition this year. Joining us on stage this afternoon is Design Miami founder Craig Robbins and CEO of the Miami Design District. We have former Design Miami curatorial director Wava Carpenter, former executive director and chief creative officer Rodman Primack, and the 2024 and 2025 Design Miami curatorial director Glenn Adamson. These 4 panelists represent the Design Miami story from the inaugural 2005 edition to this moment today, and we're elated that they're able to join us and explore our evolution. Our panelists are joined on stage by moderator Spencer Bailey, co-founder and editor-in-chief of the New York-based media company, The Slowdown, as well as the host of Time-Sensitive podcast. Spencer, thank you for leading today's conversation, and I hand it to you.
Thank you, Jen. So, first off, very excited to be on stage with all 4 of you. I know you all have a lot to say about the fair, so we're going to try and pack as much as we can into the 45 minutes we have before we open up to some audience questions. I thought I'd start in the now with Glenn and this blue sky theme, and just kind of thinking about where the fair is now, how you thought about the blue sky theme within the context of 20 years of this fair.
Sure, thanks, Spencer. When devising the theme for this year, I suppose I was thinking mainly about the role of design in the broader world. And it occurred to me that at this moment of challenge, conflict, design was one of the big positive stories we can tell about ourselves collectively. And Design Miami, of course, is the central platform for the contemporary where new design enters the world. So the idea here, of course, is to allude to the idea of blue sky thinking and imaginative leaps, open horizons. But it's also a nod to climate change and perhaps most importantly, the idea that there's one sky over all of us, so across borders, across classifications, across the street, and here in Design Miami. So blue sky is a kind of unifying theme, a universal theme.
And did you consider any sort of previous themes in the context of that one?
I did, yeah. It was very interesting to look back at the history of theming and think about different directions that had taken. So, for example, Eric Chen's themes, which are more about materials and the elements. Last year's theme by Anna Karnick, which was Where We Stand, which is maybe a more political or socio-political framing for design. I guess I just felt like at this moment what we really needed was a dose of optimism, sort of optimism in the face of challenge.
Yeah, makes me think too of Wava's theme from just a couple years ago. Was it Human Nature?
Humankind.
Humankind, yeah. Let's go back to the very beginning, Craig. So 2000, you create the Design District, and obviously design was something that was coming up in the zeitgeist, but it wasn't, I don't think design had the sort of global power that kind of took over in the 2000s and the 2010s. And the Design District and the fair, I think, have had a pretty significant impact in shaping certain conversations around design, certainly here in Miami, if not nationally or internationally. Tell us a bit about just the impetus to create the Design District and how in turn that led to the founding of Design Miami 5 years later.
I have a really short answer. So it's a bit of an odyssey. I started in South Beach when it wasn't much. And at that time, I liked design, but basically you get cool design by going to thrift shops. That was where you could find design. It wasn't really out there. And then when I started in the Design District, initially I wanted to bring back what was historically there, the furniture design. And I was going to Salone a lot, and I discovered, brands like Adra, which Simona was with, and how they would do these like cool things like the rope chairs with the Campagna brothers. And so there were like these things that were not technically limited edition design, but that was the only like cool contemporary design that I knew about. And simultaneously, I was a bit frustrated because there wasn't, South Beach had been a big thing for Miami, but it was known as like a party town, and I didn't like that. And so the first thing that we initiated was a group of us worked with Sam Keller and brought Art Basel to Miami. And the design district became sort of an epicenter for alternative things during Art Basel. The Pompidou did a show, the Guggenheim would do things with us, galleries, fashion brands. It started, and I was spending a ton of money because I was like using it as marketing for the design district, but it wasn't like making any profit or wasn't a business. And then, and so Art Basel really like catapulted Miami and made it known as like a cultural place, not just a party place. But we took the sex appeal of Miami and added it to the profound tradition of Art Basel, and it kind of exploded. And so the next step was like, how do we begin to turn it into a business? And in 2005, I remember we were at the Venice Biennale and got together with Sam Keller, the then director of Art Basel, Friedman Benda, Patrick Sagan, Didier and Clemens from Creo. We all got together for lunch, and Sam told me we have this problem. All the design dealers want to be in Art Basel, and the art dealers don't want to let them in. And someone else is going to end up doing a design fair, and Craig, will you do it for me? And so literally like in June of 2005, we agreed that in December, we would do the first Design Miami show. Just 6 months later, we took the Moore building. That year we gave Zaha Hadid the award of Designer of the Year. She did the Elastica sculpture, which is still in there. And Design Miami was launched.
And Wava, you were technically, in a way, employee number one, or one of the earliest employees. Talk about getting this thing off the ground. What was it like from your vantage? And maybe just share some anecdotes from the first year or two. What stands out to you?
Okay, so Design 05 had happened, and I was hired in early 2006 because the decision to go to Basel was already there, and they needed help. And I just was kind of over there for 3-4 months in Basel, where I'd never been before, in fact, just trying to put the show together. And there were other people that were there in Switzerland helping, but it was very hard. Like, I mean, I don't know, the current staff for Design Miami kind of comes and goes, whether there's a fair, but, you know, there's been as many as, I don't know, like 16 people on staff. Like at the time, there was sort of like me and 2 contractors, and the show had like 17 galleries and a partnership with Vitra. And I mean, we were very proud, but the early days were rough. Fun, but rough.
Yeah. And what was the sort of public response to this new fair from your perspective? Like, how were people thinking about a design fair at that time versus, say, maybe today, 20 years later?
You know, it's interesting. So between like 2005 to 2008, there was a lot of discussion about design being collectible, and you know, the term design art was being used quite a bit there then. And nobody really liked the term, but nobody knew how to talk about this design that wasn't mass-produced or like coming out of a modernist tradition. And in fact, I got invited to a panel discussion in maybe like 2007 in Geneva, and MoMA was there talking about how Design Miami was going to destroy design because design's not supposed to be collectible. It's supposed to be for everybody. But I mean, that was just like one voice at the time. I mean, at the same time, so many people were like, my God, this fair has so much energy. It's so much better than like the kind of antiques fair that had come before. And it kind of was visually kind of really different than Art Basel. So, I mean, it quickly became a very popular fair with the crowd.
Rodman, you've been hovering around this thing basically from the start too. Share a little bit about your perspective in terms of your earliest memories and also how you think about those in that sort of longer view context.
Well, I'm so happy to be up here with all of you, and it's such a pleasure to hear history and remember this. And I remember so clearly, for me, and I can't remember if it was maybe 2007, 2006, the fair was definitely on the other side, was in the district still. And at night, there was always interesting things happening. And I remember that there was one year, and you guys can tell me what year it was, that Rick Ritt was actually cooking in, he was in this really great, wood box almost. And he was like cooking food. And then there was someone was doing tattoos at night and had this amazing energy. And I remember feeling so happy that this was happening at the same time as Basel, because Basel felt, even then, sort of like stiff and confined. And to arrive at this place that felt so alive and so vibrant and filled with kind of promise, and a promise for something different and something interesting. And obviously I came from, at the time I was at Phillips, and we were sort of bookending Design Miami in trying to establish what would become the collectible design platform. The auctions at Phillips were very reflective of what was happening at the fair, and sort of together, I think we were building this market that would become the collectible design market. But I just remember, I'm seeing it in my mind right now, how vibrant it felt, and how cool, and and not exclusive in a way. That there's such an imprimatur around the art world that art is exclusive, and it's important, and all of those things. And there was something about the spirit of Design Miami, even at that moment, that felt that it was really reaching out to younger people and to the city and to lots of people to get them excited and interested in design.
Can I just say that I think Craig, being a collector and so passionate about the material, you were like the best patron for this upstart thing that, was trying to be so much more youthful and energetic.
I had no choice. You were telling me if I didn't buy anything, we wouldn't have a fair.
I mean, we did say that for years.
Being serious about it, it was this moment that's hard to understand today, because when I was sort of explaining it, how if you wanted to collect design, you could sort of go and buy these more mass-produced but exclusive kind of things like the Campagna chairs at Adra. But people didn't know. It did exist in a few galleries, but people didn't know about limited edition contemporary design, which obviously is a different process. Like, if you're just going to make 15 of something, what you can create is a lot different than if you've got to mass produce it in a factory at a certain price point and everything. And so it's sort of the same approach that is taken to art, where someone does a painting or a sculpture, but it's making a functional object. And Design Miami, of course, collaborating with Art Basel in this moment, really brought that to the world. It introduced it to a larger audience. And Wava talks about how hard she was struggling, but what they did was incredible. It was I was getting all the credit. So, everybody was blown away and really shocked by it at the time. And it had a big impact on Miami and a big impact on the cultural world in general.
Well, yeah, Craig, I wanted to ask about this sort of juncture or interaction between Art Basel and Design Miami. It almost seems like, and based loosely on some of what Rodman was saying, without Design Miami, Art Basel maybe would have stayed a little stiff. Design Miami brought a bit of the party. Would you?
Is this being recorded? I think that Design Miami had a freedom that Art Basel didn't. It was this very profound, traditional, the most important art fair in the world. And so they were working within certain metrics. And we had this freedom to kind of do whatever we wanted, and there weren't the same boundaries. And so I would say a better real explanation is the two complemented each other really well. It brought more people, it gave more people access, it was a bigger cause, and it was always very collaborative. From the beginning, Art Basel was a partner in Design Miami, and we had been a partner, not in ownership, but in bringing it here. So there were very close relationships. Art Basel would market, before Design Miami, the design district was the only thing they would market. It was called Art Loves Design. and there would be these like activations in the design district, like I was mentioning, from 2002 until Design Miami started in 2005. So it was really like this cool organic process, and I would say that Design Miami definitely added an additional dimension to the whole experience this week.
And, you know, like Art Basel, it has its location in the name, Miami. This question kind of goes to all of you. How do you think about that sort of Miami brand name becoming something global? Because this thing has sort of expanded. It's in Paris, it's gone to Shanghai, it's in Los Angeles. It's sort of exporting Miami in a way, or an idea of Miami. Craig, I'm sure you have an answer to that. Wava, I'm sure you do too. Any of you, jump in.
I would say that it can be both like a blessing and a curse, the Miami-ness of it. But in the reality, I think that Miami has this, like, you know, there are places in the world that immediately conjure an idea of something. And Miami definitely has that. And it can be palm trees and fast cars. And if you're from the 1980s, it's like Miami Vice. And, you know, there's so much that's built into our idea about Miami that, as a fair director and as someone that worked at the fair, it was always really fun to be able to play off of that. It's such a deep root. But as Craig was saying, Art Basel and Design Miami were at the same time totally changing what Miami is. And now Miami is this much more sophisticated place. It's not just palm trees and sand and you know, Tubbs and Crockett or whatever their names were in Miami Vice and their Ferraris, like chasing after criminals. It's like this very international city. And I think it really helped the world connect with design through Miami, through a city that was totally building itself at the same time. If we look back at pictures of what Miami looked like 20 years ago, the skyline, the neighborhoods and things, it was a totally different city. And now it's a city that Herzog has built incredible buildings in, and Bjarke, and, you know, there's incredible things all over the district. This is a city of architecture, and part of that is embedded in the fair and in the city, and I think it's actually brought it to the public in a really strong way. Like, I don't think it's embarrassing to be like, oh, I'm from Miami. No, like, you're from Miami, and it's amazing.
Wave, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, in the early days of Design Miami and Art Basel, there was really kind of an idea of a split, that there was like Swiss culture and there was Miami culture, and that things were much more kind of out of control on this side of the Atlantic. And I think things have like evolved a bit now, and now Design Miami is very grown up, and the city of Miami is more grown up, still chaotic, but, you know, like a proper culture center. But yeah, in the early days, I mean, we had people like drunk in the show. Like, it was really like people were bringing the party into the fair, and we had to like get a little more boring, I guess, to like calm it down a bit.
I mean, the fair's not even drinking age yet, so.
So just elaborating on what Rodman and Wava said, when we started the show, there was so remember, I did all this because I wanted my city, the city I was born in and I lived in, to be known as a cultural place, not just a party town. That was like my agenda. And when we were trying to figure out what to name it, there was a lot of people who were saying, because it was a huge brand, it should be Design Basel. And that would have been sort of the easier thing to do. But no, I was insistent it was going to be Design Miami, because I wanted our city to have credit for having invented this very important piece of global cultural content.
I almost think of them as like opposite sides of the battery. And there's sort of this friction, or the energy that exists within that is in that beautiful friction between Art Basel and this sort of Swiss idea, and then Design Miami. It's like two sides of a coin almost.
I think it's also interesting there, Spencer, to think about them traveling in opposite directions in terms of the history of the relative disciplines, because, you know, in the fine art context, fairs, I think, rightly or wrongly, are often thought of as a necessary evil, and the transposition of fine art into an expressly commercial, decontextualized space is seen as a kind of bellwether of the end of the avant-garde, effectively. That's an argument you often hear at any rate. And in design, it's clearly the opposite. So until you have Design Miami, you don't really have a viable platform for a design avant-garde, which is what I usually call it, not collectible design so much. I tend to emphasize that innovative, progressive, even provocative character. So for me, this is the platform for the design avant-garde. And if you don't have the kind of centralized critical mass that this fair has provided, you just don't have an avant-garde on a global basis. And it's had an incredibly generative force as a result in the discipline. So there's also that. I like the way that you describe it as a kind of battery with these opposite poles. And to me, there's also a degree to which both fairs are obviously extremely potent enablers for all their participants. There's no doubt about that. But I think design has a special relationship to this place and this organization in the sense that you wouldn't have had anything like the kind of progressive character over the last 20 years if it didn't exist.
We haven't talked about the design word yet, although we did sort of talk a little bit about the evolution of design over the past 20 years. But I'm actually really curious in that how you all view that word, the D word, design, and think about it in the context of 2005 and then now, 2025. Like, where do you think it was then, and where do you think the design word is now in the culture, in the broader culture? What's shifted, and maybe what role has Design Miami played in that?
I mean, it's tough. I feel like the language around the material that's in Design Miami, even today, is confusing to a super broad audience. As I mentioned, just like the turn of the 21st century brought like collectible design, as we are generally calling it now, into like the auctions and the galleries, and it was becoming a thing. But at the same time, that was kind of the rise of like HGTV and like good magazines about design. So, I mean, I think we benefited in a way from the fact that just design in general, in all of its permutations, was sort of becoming into the like public conscious much more. But like I said, I mean, at the time we started, they used the word design art quite a bit to mean this material. Nobody liked it, but nobody knew what else to say, because before, in the 20th century, design had meant like functional objects that are made in like mass production and to make your life better in the most functional way. So that's changed, and then we ended up with collectible design, but now I really like design avant-garde because I think that's more accurate in a way,
I think it captures the intention more, but it seems to me that in retrospect, one might have feared that Design Miami could become a kind of dumping ground for anything that didn't get into the art fair across the street, but in fact, it's actually the opposite. Not to say that across the street is a dumping ground, but it's extremely miscellaneous experience over there. And here I think you actually have a very sharply defined persona and a strategy on the part of the makers and the designers themselves. That limited edition factor that Craig talked about earlier, sometimes uniqueness. But it seems to me that you have the kind of imagination of art, the problem-solving capabilities of design, and the physical mastery of craft fused together in one object after another, and you see that throughout the tent, and everything's firing on all cylinders all the time, essentially, and it has to be at that caliber to get into this fair now as well. So it feels really razor sharp in a way that actually I don't think other fairs can muster.
I think I agree with both of you, and I think thinking about capital D design versus like small d design, this kind of like design, I think that it comes back to the founding kind of principles and Craig's spirit as well, that is a really generous spirit, and it's a really kind of broad spirit, that this has been a place that Salone, if you've ever been, is amazing and totally overwhelming, but it's also super focused on professionals. It's a fair, and it's an environment that I really think is focused on professionals to professionals. And I think Design Miami was a place that immediately was about connecting with the public and connecting with an audience that is either a collecting audience or a buying audience or just an interested audience. And I think there's been such a spirit of wanting to share in that. And I think that it has really, over the years, changed the way that we as a culture talk, it's not MTV Cribs and it's not World of Interiors. It's somewhere in the middle where these things can all exist and where we can talk about, design that is changing and shaping the world, because it is, and we can talk about design that is changing and shaping our bed. And those two things can be at the same level. One is not more important than the other. They're working together, and I think this is a place where that conversation happens and has then kind of radiated out.
Well, and it's not lost on me that probably the most catalytic design object of all time, the iPhone, arrived in 2007. So actually, this fair sort of coincides with the smartphone and the dissemination of information, of design as a sort of communication tool in a way. And then with Instagram, of course, it just kind of took off even more. How do you, Craig?
So a lot of times, we forget once things have totally changed the way they were. In 2000, when I started with the Design District, before Design Miami, in the United States, except for a few European companies, if you wanted to buy design, the only place you could go for high-end design, and this is mass-produced high-end design, was into some fortress-like mall, which you were not allowed into without a licensed decorator. It was treated like prescription medicine. Literally. I remember, so when we did the Design District, the first thing we did was we said design should be on the street and everybody should be able to walk into the stores, which was more of the European model, but it wasn't the US model. And I remember doing a story with the New York Times. The writer came down and he thought I was totally out of my mind. So he went to this mall, Dakota. This is a journalist with the New York Times. He got there and he said, I'm doing a story for the New York Times. And Dakota said, you need a licensed decorator or you're not allowed in. And so that was kind of the world of design. And then, design was on the street. It began to demystify it in a way and bring it to people. And on the collectible or the avant-garde, at the end of the day, it's neither. It's just design. But on that, what I find most interesting personally is if you think about, I'm an art collector. And so before the world of Design Miami, if you are making a space, you could have incredible art on the wall, but then really the choices of design that you could have to complement that were very limited. And now you think about just the overall experience of living and being able to have these two creative disciplines that are very related but have different purposes in a way, and being able to make an environment with them and how radically different that is and how much, at least for me, more enjoyable it is.
I'm glad you said that, Craig, because I remember early in my career when I worked at an auction house, I would go visit these amazing collections over and over again. That was my job, to go look at amazing art. And I would leave sometimes almost in tears because the furniture sucked so much. And I'd be like, I don't understand how these people can make these choices and have such beautiful, incredible artworks and then sit on these chairs. Why is this happening? And now, when that happens, that happens much less now. And it's partly thanks to this place. Well, I'd say even more than partly.
Yeah, in some sense, Design Miami has been an incubator, not just for designers to experiment, but also for the home. And maybe we could jump into that. What are some of the things that have been incubated at the fair that stand out to you each the most? I know we've had some highlights rolling on the screen behind us. So perhaps there could be things from over the years that have stood out to you that you remember the most. Craig, I'm sure you have a million answers to this question. But yeah, just thinking about how the fair has been served as an incubator for design and in turn, the home, and what are the projects that stand out the most over the years to each of you?
I have to speak again. You know, for me, I really look back and love those collaborative things that we did where we would give an award to someone because we would be taking design and making it, you know, more public in a way, but working with, and the first was Zaha Hadid, who did Elastica, then Mark Newson did the fence in front of Dash, you know, and he's such a brilliant person. The year Tokajin did, it's on the screen, as I knew that was coming. But was it 2 million straws? So in the Moore building, there was this installation by Tokajin with 2 million straws. And it was like, you know, these were like experiences. And for me, I love that. And it's part of what we do in the design district. So I like taking what we do like more privately or what I do as a collector, but then bringing it to the public and making these like really interesting experiences or outdoor environments.
Again, if I think back to the very early days, so this is when a lot of people didn't understand what was in Design Miami. Nobody had heard of the fair before. I mean, it took a couple of years for it to really kind of break through to a larger audience. I mean, we had very good attendees coming from Art Basel. There was very good crossover, but it was still like people didn't really know about it. So we always kind of talked about how we had to think about it like having a really great dinner party, you know, and that you need people from uptown and downtown, and you need kind of like older intellectual people, and you need to also have kind of younger, more fashionable people. And I mean, it's just a metaphor for the idea that like we really wanted to break through by combining all these things. So having the like serious, you know, curated, vetted material that would be, you know, similar to like Art Basel, you know, for very serious collectors. But at the same time, we did a lot of, you know, asking designers to come do special projects just for us that were often like kind of bootstrapped, and, you know, like we put it together as quickly as we could. And they were very young, like people who were just kind of making a name, like Max Lamb and Martin Bass, people who became like very big names, you know, soon after. But I think I'm very proud of the fact that we sort of mixed like being increasingly like every year more elevated and more mature, but like starting from a place of kind of like scrappy downtown, like subversive a little bit.
I think it's important, or when I think about it, I think a lot about how we look at houses today and how Radha and I was saying earlier, how homes have changed. And I think if you look at shelter magazines, there's only a few left, but if you look at shelter magazines or what's now a shelter magazine, which is Instagram, basically you see that taste has evolved and shifted so much. And I think it's very much related to Design Miami and the pervasiveness of being able to look at things from disparate periods sitting next to each other. So I think the idea of, you know, a Carlo Molino like chair next to a Haas Brothers, you know, standing lamp. I think that honestly comes from people seeing those things in juxtaposition here. And over time, that's become a much more pervasive way of living, that we combine old things and new things and funny things with very serious things. And I think that has to do a lot with being able to see it in this environment where things are mixed.
I might just add a couple of things. One thing I should say is I started coming regularly in 2013 because I had been over in London at the Victoria and Albert Museum without a travel budget up until then. So that's when I picked up the story from a first-hand point of view. And at that time, Nadia Swarovski's collaboration with the fair was extremely impactful. So that was one of the things you regularly showed up for, wondering what would happen next. And I do think those partnerships, Fendi would be another one that's been in the frame for a long time, and others, obviously. So the kind of creative operationalization of corporate partnership, I think, has also been innovated here at the fair in a way that's been influential more broadly outside the design space. And of course, there's the talent factory thing that you mentioned. I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is the importance of historic design in the fair, which we haven't touched on so much. But I was thinking, I think we had a slide of it of the Prouvé house being brought here as an exhibit, which is such a museum level move. And in general, I suppose the reframing of particularly European historic design with its own avant-garde credentials in this fair, I think gave that material a totally different aspect for an American audience. And that's another maybe secondary, but I think also extremely significant thing that the fair has achieved.
Yeah, and there's obviously, we're talking about the objects, but there's the culture of the fair too. And I've always loved coming to this fair, kind of in part also not just for what I'm going to see in each of the booths, but who's going to be here. I mean, I remember seeing like Sylvester Stallone walking through here, or Kanye, or Pharrell. There really is a culture that the fair built around it, and that sort of mythos, I think, has also contributed to design and the importance of telling stories about design. I mean, some of the celebrities I just mentioned have really shined a light on design in a way and reaching audiences that would not have been reached had they not walked through the front door here. How do you each, or Craig especially, I guess, how do you think about that? Like the context of maybe not so much celebrity, but the fair as cultural arbiter, as something that, you know, storytelling can get very, you know, has a broader reach because of who walks through the door here.
You know, I think that has always been like a part of Design Miami. One of my favorite stories, you've kind of brought it up, is Pharrell and I were doing a talk like this. And then, like, in the middle of the talk, Pharrell says, "Oh, I want to introduce someone." And Kanye had walked in. And it's like these moments that bring different aspects of culture together in a fun way. And so I think, you know, we touched on it before, how Design Miami has been, you know, more open, more accessible. People always tell me, especially people who don't really understand art as well, like, "Oh, I love Design Miami. I liked it so much better than the art fair." Because design is also more accessible. And so it gives people a bridge to creativity, I think, in a much faster and easier way than art does. And it's not to say it isn't equally as profound, but it's easier for people to relate to.
That's maybe a sign that I've run out of battery. But I wanted to quickly say something that I think is interesting, which is the kind of the overlap of Design Miami, the Miami Design District, creativity in architecture and design, and the impetus for brands to now need to brand themselves so significantly through design and architecture, which 20 years ago, it wasn't really that big of a deal. You built like a good-looking shop, but you didn't need to build a shop with X. You didn't have to push it and do a collaboration with Y. And I think that does come partly from here and from what Craig built in the district, and just the way that those things fertilized each other and pushed us to want more as consumer, and brands to understand that they needed to tell a much stronger story. And if you guys probably don't know this, but Craig knows this, because Virgil, who was a good friend of ours, told us one night in Basel that Virgil Abloh, who was a really major design talent in the world and was the director of Louis Vuitton, Craig and I introduced him to Louis Vuitton here at the fair because he had a small booth here that he was doing a small furniture project that he wanted to show. And Louis Vuitton at the time was one of the sponsors of the fair, and Michael Burke was walking around with Craig, and it just was like this moment that they met. And Virgil told us one night, Basel was like, "I'm actually here as being like the biggest voice in fashion at this moment because you guys introduced me to Michael Burke and Louis Vuitton." And that's kind of incredible. And that's what this fair has been about. And that's what I think the promise of this kind of a platform is.
You know, another great example of this in a different cultural space would be the impact on museums. So I think it's important to note that it's not like there's a convention for design curators, right? So the moment that design curators in America meet one another, not just in America, internationally, is here. And this is where they get to know one another and they do business. And of course, a lot of the objects that you will see in their galleries across the country will have been acquired here at Design Miami as well. So that's kind of a behind the scenes thing of that exchange between experts that's also empowered by the fair. And of course, it has this incredible knock-on effect. Those objects will be on view in those galleries for decades, generations to come.
Yeah, I mean, Rodman, hearing your story, it made me think of a personal anecdote I have. I've bought a couple things at the fair over the years, and the first one I bought was this bench by an artist, Julian Watts. He's been in one of the slides, the sort of wall installation he did last year. But this bench was sort of pig-like looking, anthropomorphic a little bit, a cross-laminated timber bench. Anyway, I told the gallerist Patrick Parrish if he didn't sell it by Friday night, text me with a good deal and we'll work it out. And so we did, and a couple months later, I got a text message from Patrick saying, I'm gonna need to borrow the bench. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he goes, yeah, it needs to go to London. It's a finalist for the Wava Craft Prize. And I was the editor-in-chief of Surface magazine at the time, and through Surface got invited by Wava to come to London, unbeknownst to them that this bench that I had acquired was gonna be in this exhibition. And so a few months later, it's May 2018, and I'm standing on the London Tube looking at this Wava advertisement on the wall of the bench. And it was just like this surreal thing where it's like, wait, like 7 months ago, that was in a booth at Design Miami, and I was just like, I love this object, I want this. And I guess I'm saying this story as a sort of metaphor for the power of this fair, like that it's the people who come in here, it's the objects and the lives they live within the booth, and then post. I don't know if there's other anecdotes or anything else that any of you would care to share about the objects and the lives they live, because I know, Craig, there's been several objects of yours that are not only in your house or on your lawn or a part of the design district. So maybe you might have a few stories like that.
One fun one was one year we did a satellite show. Sometimes we do shows that weren't in the fair, but were in the design district. And so Norman Foster brought Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion, and I had acquired the original 25-foot fly's eye dome. And so we installed it. Norman came, of course. The Buckminster Fuller Institute put a couple of sort of trailers on the site that had drawings of Bucky's. And I also optioned the 50-footer. So I had the right to buy, because Bucky did 3 of them. Norman owned the 12-foot dome. I owned the 25-foot dome, and I had the rights to the 50-footer. And then it turned out Crystal Bridges wanted to buy it, which I thought would be a lot better than if I had it. And so Crystal Bridges bought the dome, and it's now at Crystal Bridges. And now you walk today, and almost like pretty much where the dome was shown on the land back then, that's where the dome is on Palm Court in the design district.
Well, I guess to finish this talk, and then we'll open it up to some audience questions, I wanted to end on a philosophical note, perhaps. Curious about how you each think about the ultimate value of design. Because, you each have your own distinct perspective on it, and understanding that within the context of the fair, having been so deeply immersed in the world that is Design Miami, what ultimately to you at the end of the day is the greatest power, greatest value, greatest asset of great design?
Should I go? I mean, that's a big question. And what I would like to say is that I think design is still undervalued. Having started nearly 20 years ago trying to showcase this work in front of art collectors and explain why it should have, more value than, what you could get at just a store, we've done that work. And, the whole time, a lot of the reasons why it was different and special was that it was handmade. Like most of the stuff here is like handmade. And now, like, I used to talk about craft and people would be like, that's a granny thing. I'm like, no, this is like really amazing work. You should pay attention. And now, like, craft is so big that it's over in the art fair making more money than it would here. And so to all the art collectors, I think you need to invest in design a bit more.
I think that there's so much promise in design, and I think that design is meant to make our lives better, all of our lives. And I think that it does make our lives better. And good design choices and understanding and being able to put parameters around your decision making that's based on understanding design just is going to help all of us, all across the board. So keep coming back.
I guess just to go back to where we started, which is this question of optimism, I think the thing I didn't say is that the thing about design, which is very different from fine art, is that it's got a kind of inbuilt reality check. So there's the friction of functionalism, there's the friction of material knowledge, material intelligence. It just has a lot of technical qualities that need to be respected, which may or may not be applicable in an art context. So it's not just optimism, it is a kind of informed optimism that's tested constantly and is kind of subjected to a creative friction. And so for me, it exemplifies a level of responsibility and pragmatism that I think is the right context in which to experience human ingenuity, human optimism, and therefore, whether it's directly because of the role it plays in our lives in object form, or whether it's more metaphorically because of how it performs as a role model, I think it has a very unique place in human culture. And again, this place is the best place to encounter it.
I always say that art is like a frontier from which mankind advances. And when I say that, what I'm really saying is that contemporary art and contemporary design, the inventiveness that then influenced subsequent generations, the real talented creative people that change the way we think, that change the way we see things, that impact us neurologically, they are a frontier from which mankind advances. Is that philosophical?
Definitely.
All right, I was trying.
Well, I would just add my own little answer, which is interesting because none of you used the word beauty, or mentioned beauty. But I guess this ties with Glenn's optimism idea. I interviewed Stefan Sagmeister for my time-sensitive podcast. This was a couple years ago. He had published a book called Beauty. And in it, he makes a case that if we're surrounded by beauty, it's actually making us better people. That if you're surrounded in an ugly environment, you're becoming an asshole. Those are his words, not mine. And I just think it's interesting that design is something that crosses all scales. And when design and beauty coalesce in such a way, and the art world, by the way, hates, or not so much anymore, but for a long time, the art world did not like to talk about beauty. But in design, in some sense, I don't think there was as much fear about talking about it because it did connect to decoration, it did connect to comfort, some of these other things. So I actually think also a great value of design is encouraging more beauty in the world. And that goes across all scales. And, just look at Craig's design district, right? Like, I think what you've done there is really encourage and build a bridge toward a different idea of thinking about urban planning from a beauty perspective. Think about the Burlex intervening there, or, what you did by bringing the Dymaxion in, or all the different architectural collaborators that have been a part of shaping the sort of retail experience of and just the experience of what it means to be in that neighborhood, to walk through it. So I guess this is to say my answer would be that design is a means toward beauty. And with that, I would like to open it up to the audience. I imagine there might be a few questions out there. Please don't be afraid. There is Dustin with the microphone. Anyone? Couple ants.
Sure. So you started to answer it maybe in your last explanation, but generally, what has the role of not only the fair but design been in relationship to the urban fabric? So you have a fair in the middle of the city of Miami, and then right across the water you have the design district that has its sort of own created urban reality. How do you, I guess, pair yourself with these two different contexts, and how do you see urbanism as something that helps ground design?
That's for you, right, Wava? So what I think we've done that has been very helpful to us is integrated the two. So Design Miami initially was a major marketing device for the design district. And when I say marketing, marketing sort of has a cheaper kind of connotation, but it was profound cultural content that was invented in the Miami Design District. It gave people a connection. And so part of having neighborhoods or urban design is also having the right kind of content in those neighborhoods. And Design Miami was a major catalyst to getting people to see the neighborhood in a certain way. Then through the years of Design Miami, it has also been a major source of permanent content, like Bucky's Fly's Eye Dome, or Konstantin Grichik has Netscape, a seating sculpture that's there. The Burlak Brothers installation, which was mentioned, a lot of the stuff that we've done in the neighborhood was sort of born in Design Miami. The connection was Design Miami, the relationships were Design Miami, and we've taken it and added it to the experience. So when you walk around the neighborhood, it's like an outdoor museum of art, architecture, and design. And so I think that there's this thing which is, the urban design is really just how you lay the place out and deal with the circulation. And then that won't work by itself. You need content. You need to put things in the places and add to the experience of it. And Design Miami has been a major catalyst to the success of what the design district has become.
Another question? I think you had one, yeah.
In your attempt to bring these conceptual ideas right to the mainstream, do you feel as though, right, at the end of the day, everything's coming to an art fair, right? These big ideas that are kind of not being limited to the bounds of a building are being created and being brought to a space and being exhibited for the world to see. Do you feel that our understanding of like what the avant-garde can be is now further limited because it has to fit within the confines of an exhibition and a specific space?
Shall I try to answer that? I think you have to ask compared to what. So I might make the argument that compared to the historical avant-garde, Design Miami is a radically popular context. And the very nature of innovation, broadly speaking, but particularly innovation that's not backed by intense capitalization and private interest, is that it fights for space. Fights for space in an inattention economy like we have now, fights for space in an industrial economy like we had when the Bauhaus was active. And I think I might argue that, while accepting the force of your question, that a design fair is still, relatively speaking, kind of a niche or elite phenomenon, that if you look at it in the broader sweep of design history, it's as popular a delivery mechanism for the avant-garde as we've found so far. Now, will it eventually, partly because of digital tools and everything that goes with them in terms of communication and fabrication and all the rest of it, mass customization, will we eventually evolve to a state where the design fair is no longer necessary as that channel of communication? Probably. How long that will take is hard to say. But I think that just as a historian, my sense is that this is kind of as good as it's gotten so far, and that there's a lot to appreciate, while of course always trying to find new ways to bring the best ideas to the greatest number of people that we possibly can.
The reason why I'm asking is because I feel that when I think of the avant-garde, right, I think of people who are pushing the boundaries, who would immediately be the first to reject traditional notions of what art should look like, what design should look like, within the context of having to sell it. Which I guess is kind of related to the point that you were bringing before that.
What you're always looking for is an escape hatch from conformity and conservatism. That's what the avant-garde is, right? And so by the very nature of things, that's always going to be an argument that needs to be made, and it's going to need to find various forms of support. And fortunately, here we have the patronage and the context in which to see that happening live and in front of our eyes.
Do you feel that when you're trying to curate a theme for an event like this, that you do have to fight against what you think is kind of the limitation of what art can be? Does that make sense?
I don't. I mean, I think as a curatorial director here this year, certainly, it's my first whirlwind. I feel like it's been absolutely in the spirit of the organization, what we've been trying to do. I don't know if what my predecessors here would say about that, but I think the frontier is outside the fair. It's not inside the fair.
I agree with sort of the notion of it, and I understand also. I think what you're saying, that the market itself sort of ends up shaping what we end up designing and bringing, and all of those things, and that is as true across the street as it is here. But I also think it's just so important to realize that without the market, a lot of these ideas never become anything anyway, because they stay an idea. And so there are definitely forces that impact the scale and the idea. You want to sell something, you want to bring it here to sell, but within that, part of the thing of what happens here is that designers are taking a studio practice, or allowed to take something that probably will not end up being manufactured or end up in a really broad context. They're able to explore that in an environment like here. And from that, they're usually, or they can, take an idea that can distill and then become something that is used in a much broader context, or become something like Konstantin Grigic is looking at the way that a joint is made in a shelf that is relevant to something that he made for Creo, that actually becomes something that is embedded into something that he makes for a huge, that he makes thousands of. He's only made 7 of it for Creo, but he's taken that. And I think that that's where you see the real, that's the really exciting part of it, is that it's driven by commerce, and it's also maybe shaped by commerce, but it becomes something broader, and it then can become something bigger.
Just elaborating on what Rodman said, think about how much creativity came out of Russia and the Soviet bloc from 1945 to 2000. And then think about how much creativity came out of the rest of Europe and the rest of the world that wasn't part of that communist bloc. So capitalism and the market certainly is a factor in driving all of this. And if you compare the two, where everything was ideal and there was no market, it didn't seem to drive as much creativity.
I think I'll finish with one last question, which is, and for those of you who might have been able to attend Glenn and my talk on Thursday night about his new book, A Century of Tomorrows, just to plug that, you should all get it. It's a question about the future. And Glenn, you sort of said that there might be different delivery mechanisms than a fair in the future, but I was curious if we're now celebrating this milestone of 20 years, where do you all think Design Miami will be 20 years from now? What would a design fair look like? And I asked this sort of half joking, because Glenn said that anyone who predicts the future usually gets a bunch of things wrong. But I think we should just get our tarot cards out a little bit, and I'd love to hear your answers to this, where each of you imagine the fair might be in 20 years.
So the line, I think, is nothing dates faster than the future, right? I just was thinking about something Paola Antonelli said on our panel yesterday about AI in relation to design, which was an unbelievable kind of historically significant conversation we had. It was recorded, so it'll be on the website next week. So if you missed it, definitely check it out. It was like a kind of, for me anyway, it was a real kind of paradigm shifting conversation. But she said that she expected design to dissolve into the cultural landscape. So it would enter our bodies, our clothes, our objects, so that we would stop even perceiving it as distinct, which I think is probably right in one direction of travel, one vector of travel. But I also think that, to your point, Wava, about craft becoming more and more significant on both sides of the street, both fairs, I think every action produces a counter-reaction. And I think that as that dissolution or melding occurs, my guess is that you're going to see greater and greater energy being placed into these limited edition and unique objects, and that furthermore the digital tools at our disposal will make them more and more amazing, to the point where you might have a single object being shown in 20 years here that has the comparable investment of a Hollywood film today, and that might be sitting in an object just humming away in front of you, and something that a very fortunate person can actually acquire, but the rest of us will kind of look at and be awestruck. So my prediction is that the direction of travel towards, on the one hand, dematerialization, and on the other hand, incredible intensification of material qualities as invested in an object will both increase in competition with one another.
Anyone else?
You really want me to go after that?
Yeah, that feels pretty final, like a good note to end on and think about, happy or not, I'm not sure.
I don't know if that's a happy story or a sad one, but...
Any closing thoughts, Craig?
No, other than it's just great to be here and great to be with all of you, and nice to be with my friends and sharing these memories. It's really been a fun experience, so thank you.
Craig, Wava, Rodman, Glenn, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.